Most drivers banned by NASCAR for drugs check into rehab, not Brian Rose. After police arrested him with drugs hidden in his underwear and a gun in his car, he pivoted to a new trade, high-level financial fraud. Using his status as a former NASCAR driver, Rose built a fake coal company and extracted $15 million from investors. He burned that massive sum on racehorses, Las Vegas casinos, and funding his own race team. The operation only collapsed when the Secret Service directly intervened, seizing his assets and securing a 9-year federal prison sentence. This is the case file on the most calculated and reckless criminal in motorsport history. Brian Rose was born on October 19, 1979. Bowling Green is located in Warren County. It is an industrial region with a heavy manufacturing presence, most notably the assembly plant for the Chevrolet Corvette. The local culture is deeply tied to automotive engineering and speed. However, Brian Rose did not enter the racing industry through the traditional developmental channels. The standard progression for a stock car driver involves years of competing in local short tracks, usually driving heavily modified street cars on dirt or asphalt. It requires drivers to build their own engines, weld their own chassis, and secure small-scale local sponsorships to pay for tires and fuel. It is a slow, physically demanding process designed to filter out drivers lacking extreme talent or mechanical understanding. Brian Rose bypassed this entirely. He had access to immediate high-volume capital. His father was David Rose. David Rose was a corporate businessman operating in the energy sector. He controlled multiple entities, primarily Robo Enterprises and SunClear Energy. These companies generated massive revenue streams. In the business of professional motorsports, capital dictates opportunity. David Rose used the revenue from his energy companies to directly finance his son's entry into the upper echelons of NASCAR. In the racing industry, this is formally known as a funded driver and informally known as ride buying. Teams require millions of dollars to operate. If a driver brings a family-funded check large enough to cover the team's operating costs, the team will provide the vehicle, the mechanics, and the pit crew. Talent is secondary to the check clearing the bank. In 2001, the Rose family money secured a contract in the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series. The Truck Series was and remains one of the top 3 national touring divisions in NASCAR. The machinery used in the 2001 Craftsman Truck Series was highly technical and entirely unforgiving. The vehicles were purpose-built racing machines built on a tubular steel space frame. They had an exact minimum weight requirement of 3,400 pounds without the driver. The power plant was a 358 cubic inch, naturally aspirated pushrod V8 engine. These engines produced approximately 700 horsepower. They operated at a maximum threshold of 8,000 to 9,000 revolutions per minute. The transmission was a heavy-duty 4-speed manual gearbox. The trucks utilized specific Goodyear Eagle racing slicks designed for maximum grip on highly banked asphalt ovals. The physical dynamics of driving these trucks were brutal. Unlike a standard aerodynamic race car, a racing truck has a massive flat frontal area and an open rear bed. This creates a severe aerodynamic drag coefficient. At high speeds, the air violently separates over the cab and crashes into the rear spoiler. This structural design makes the rear end of the truck inherently unstable. The trucks are prone to aerodynamic snap-over steer. If the rear tires lose traction at 160 miles per hour, the truck will instantly spin and impact the concrete retaining wall. The driver must maintain absolute physical control, constantly counter-steering against the aerodynamic forces pushing the vehicle out of the optimal racing groove. Brian Rose stepped into this mechanical environment with minimal high-level experience. He signed with Rick Ware Racing, an established organization within the garage. He was assigned the number 51 truck. The 2001 schedule placed Rose against a grid of seasoned veterans. He was racing against drivers who possessed decades of experience regarding chassis geometry, shock absorber rebound rates, and precise tire management. The results accurately reflected the disparity between purchased opportunity and earned skill. Rose competed in 15 races during the 2001 season. His statistical performance was objectively poor. He struggled to maintain the pace of the lead pack. He failed to qualify for top starting positions. His highest finish across the entire 15-race schedule was a 12th place finish. He routinely finished laps down, simply trying to keep the heavy truck off the wall and log laps. Despite the lack of performance, the financial backing remained intact. The check from David Rose's energy companies cleared. The number 51 truck continued to show up at the track. The garage recognized Brian Rose as a driver with a limitless budget and minimal talent. The 2001 season ended with Rose entirely off the radar of major scouts or competitive teams. Under normal circumstances, a driver with those statistics would be quietly phased out of the sport. The funding would dry up and the seat would be given to a more capable driver. But the Rose family escalated their investment. They prepared to purchase a seat with a highly competitive team for the following year. The capital was mobilized for a massive upgrade in equipment, setting up a brief spike in performance and an immediate catastrophic structural failure of Brian Rose's professional career. The 2002 NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series season demanded a massive escalation in capital. The Rick Ware racing equipment from the previous year was insufficient for consistent top 10 finishes. To compete at the front of the grid, a driver required Tier 1 equipment, factory manufacturer support, and an elite engineering staff. The Rose family provided the capital to buy exactly that. For the 2002 season, Brian Rose secured a seat with Bobby Hamilton Racing. This was a critical transition. Bobby Hamilton Racing was not a mid-level operation. It was a premier championship caliber organization based in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. More importantly, BHR possessed direct factory backing from Dodge. They fielded highly developed Dodge Ram race trucks. Factory support in 2002 meant access to proprietary wind tunnel data, dedicated chassis dynamometer time, and multi-million-dollar engineering budgets that independent teams could not afford. Brian Rose was assigned the number 4 Dodge Ram. He was immediately thrust into an environment where mechanical excuses were eliminated. If the number 4 truck ran poorly, the variable was the driver. The culture clash within the BHR shop was immediate and structural. Bobby Hamilton, the team owner, was a veteran Winston Cup Series driver. Hamilton was notoriously gritty. He built his career from absolute zero, running short tracks in Nashville and operating a tow truck to fund his early racing efforts. He survived the brutal, unregulated eras of stock car racing through immense physical endurance and strict mechanical discipline. He expected his drivers to spend time in the fabrication shop, understand the chassis geometry, and respect the mechanics building the trucks. Brian Rose arrived with a checkbook and a reputation for prioritizing his life outside the garage. The friction was inevitable, but in professional motorsports, results temporarily mask internal dysfunction. The 2002 season opened on February 15th at Daytona International Speedway. The event was the Florida Dodge Dealers 250. Daytona is a 2.5-mile high-banked tri-oval. The physics of racing a truck at Daytona in 2002 were highly specific. Because of the extreme speeds, NASCAR mandated the use of restrictor plates. These aluminum plates were installed between the carburetor and the intake manifold, choking the engine's air supply. It reduced the 700 horsepower V8 engines down to approximately 450 horsepower. This mechanical restriction completely changed the racing dynamic. Drivers could not pull away from the pack. The trucks were forced to race in tight, aerodynamically dependent clusters at 185 miles per hour. A truck running alone would punch a massive hole in the air, creating severe drag. A trailing truck would catch the slipstream, utilizing the vacuum created by the lead truck to pull forward. This is draft racing. It requires absolute spatial awareness. A miscalculation of a few inches results in a multi-vehicle crash, known in the garage as the Big One. Rose qualified the number 4 Dodge in the 15th position. The starting grid consisted of 36 trucks. The race was chaotic, dictated by heavy attrition. The aerodynamic instability of the trucks caused several massive wrecks. Drafting requires the trailing truck to physically bump the rear bumper of the lead truck to push both vehicles forward. The flat, non-aerodynamic tailgate of a 2002 racing truck made this maneuver highly dangerous. Misaligned bumpers lifted the rear tires of the lead trucks off the asphalt, triggering spins. Rose executed the race with unexpected precision. He avoided the primary wrecks. He utilized the superior horsepower of the BHR Dodge engine to hold his position in the primary draft. He trusted his spotter, maintained his racing line, and kept the truck off the concrete retaining wall. On the final lap, Robert Presley and Ted Musgrave controlled the front of the pack. Rose was positioned directly behind the leaders. When the checkered flag dropped, Rose crossed the start-finish line in 3rd place. It was a podium finish at the most famous track in North America. It validated the BHR equipment. It appeared to validate the Rose family's financial investment. It was an illusion. The 3rd place finish at Daytona was not the beginning of a breakout season. It was the absolute peak of Brian Rose's racing career. It would never happen again. As the season transitioned away from the massive superspeedways to the technical, intermediate 1.5-mile tracks and brutal short tracks, the performance of the number 4 Dodge collapsed. At tracks like Martinsville Speedway and Darlington Raceway, aerodynamic drafting is useless. Success requires the driver to manage tire wear, modulate the brake bias to prevent the rotors from melting, and provide precise technical feedback to the crew chief regarding chassis adjustments. If the truck is tight or loose, the driver must articulate exactly what the vehicle is doing on entry, center, and exit of the corners. Rose failed to provide the necessary technical data. His performance rapidly deteriorated. More critically, his behavior away from the track began to threaten the financial stability of the team. NASCAR teams operate on corporate sponsorship dollars. In 2002, primary sponsorships for a competitive truck cost between $1 million and $2 million annually. These contracts contain strict morality and performance clauses. Corporate partners demand a return on investment, measured in television exposure and brand representation. They do not tolerate erratic behavior, unreliability, or negative garage rumors. By the midpoint of the 2002 season, the BHR shop reached a breaking point. Garage reports indicated severe disciplinary issues. Rose was reportedly missing mandatory team meetings, failing to show up for sponsor obligations, and exhibiting habits that deeply concerned the team management. Bobby Hamilton had zero tolerance for an undisciplined driver jeopardizing the employment of his mechanics and the reputation of his company. The termination was swift and absolute. Bobby Hamilton Racing abruptly fired Brian Rose mid-season. They voided his contract and removed him from the number 4 Dodge. The immediate loss of Tier 1 equipment crippled Rose's trajectory. He was forced into the secondary market of the NASCAR garage. He scrambled to find teams willing to overlook his reputation in exchange for his family's money. He secured a temporary seat with Billy Bellew Motorsports, driving the number 15 Ford. When that arrangement fractured, he retreated to his former team, Rick Ware Racing. The drop in equipment quality was severe. The secondary teams lacked the engineering budgets, the fresh tires, and the engine builder contracts of BHR. Rose was driving outdated chassis with fatigued parts. The statistics from the remainder of the 2002 season outline a complete professional collapse. After the Daytona podium, Rose failed to secure another top 5 finish for the rest of the year. Out of 21 total starts in the 2002 season, he managed only 5 top 10 finishes. The remaining 16 races were plagued by crashes, mechanical failures, and laps lost to the leaders. He ended the 2002 schedule ranked 22nd in the championship standings. In a span of 9 months, Brian Rose went from a podium finish at Daytona and factory-backed equipment to an unemployed, mid-pack liability with a toxic reputation in the garage area. The professional infrastructure of his career was heavily damaged. The behavioral issues that cost him his Tier 1 seat at BHR soon escalated into criminal felony charges. The year 2003 demanded a complete professional rebuild, stripped of factory equipment and relegated back to mid-pack machinery. His career was ultimately dismantled not by a lack of speed, but by a traffic stop on a public highway. He was a 23-year-old driver attempting to buy his way back onto the starting grid using family capital. The 2003 NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series season began with a notable absence. Brian Rose did not enter the highly publicized season opening event at Daytona International Speedway. Stripped of the elite factory-backed equipment he enjoyed the previous year, he attempted to salvage his professional standing by running a severely restricted schedule. He entered just 2 races that entire year, returning to the driver's seat of the number 51 truck for Rick Ware Racing. At Darlington Raceway, a notoriously difficult track, he managed to secure a 14th place finish. However, his return was brief. A short time later at the Martinsville Speedway, he struggled to navigate the tight technical concrete corners and crossed the finish line down in 24th place. His performance was deteriorating, but his career was not ended by a lack of speed on the racetrack. It was dismantled by a traffic stop on a public highway in his hometown. The location was Bowling Green, Kentucky. The specific artery was the US 31W bypass. The US 31W bypass is a major commercial corridor running directly through the center of Bowling Green. It is a 4-lane, highly trafficked surface street lined with retail centers and intersections. It is heavily patrolled by the Bowling Green Police Department. It is not an environment for high-speed maneuvering. In the early months of 2003, shortly after his disastrous start to the racing season, Brian Rose was operating a sport utility vehicle on this bypass. The mechanics of the incident are strictly documented in local police and court records. A patrol officer with the Bowling Green Police Department observed the SUV moving erratically. The vehicle was failing to maintain its lane. It was exhibiting sudden, uncalculated shifts in speed and direction. In traffic enforcement, these are the primary mechanical indicators of an impaired driver. Furthermore, the officer ran the vehicle's license plates through the onboard computer system. The registration tags were expired. The officer had multiple points of probable cause. The light bar was activated. The traffic stop was initiated. When a police officer approaches a vehicle during a suspected DUI stop, the procedure is highly systematic. The officer evaluates the driver's motor skills, the visual condition of the vehicle's interior, and the immediate odors venting from the rolled-down window. As the officer approached Rose's SUV, the standard protocols escalated immediately. The officer detected a strong, undeniable odor of marijuana and alcohol emanating from the cabin. Simultaneously, the officer observed Rose making frantic physical movements. Rose was actively chewing on a large, dense substance. The human jaw is not designed to break down raw, unburnt cannabis. The fibrous plant material is tough, dry, and highly pungent. Rose was attempting a desperate, physically impossible method of destroying physical evidence. He was trying to eat a large quantity of raw marijuana before the officer reached the window. The officer ordered Rose to stop chewing and exit the vehicle. Rose was forced to spit the unburnt plant material out of his mouth. This specific action upgraded his legal jeopardy. He was no longer just facing a traffic citation or a standard possession charge. He was actively tampering with physical evidence, which elevates the severity of the offense in the criminal justice system. Rose was detained. The officer proceeded with a search of his person. The search was thorough. Officers discovered an additional, separate quantity of marijuana. Rose had deliberately concealed it inside his underwear. With contraband located on the driver, the officers possessed the legal authority to conduct a full forensic search of the SUV's interior. The vehicle search transitioned the incident from a narcotics arrest to a severe weapons violation. Inside the cabin, officers located a velvet Crown Royal liquor bag. Inside that bag, they found a .38 caliber handgun. The mechanics of the weapon are critical. A .38 caliber revolver or semi-automatic pistol is a heavy, lethal piece of machinery. The police report noted that the firearm was fully loaded. It was not locked in a case. It was not stored in the trunk. It was loaded, concealed in a liquor bag, and situated within immediate physical reach of an impaired driver. The combination of factors was legally disastrous. Operating a motor vehicle under the influence, possession of a controlled substance, tampering with physical evidence, operating a vehicle with expired tags, and carrying a concealed loaded deadly weapon without the proper statutory permits. Brian Rose was arrested, handcuffed, and transported to the Warren County Regional Jail. The mugshot taken that night captured a 23-year-old athlete who had just effectively detonated his own career. He was booked into the system and held until he posted a $10,000 cash bond the following day. The local news outlets in Bowling Green immediately reported the arrest. The wire services picked up the police blotter. Within hours, the details of the traffic stop reached the NASCAR headquarters in Daytona Beach, Florida. NASCAR operates as an absolute dictatorship regarding the conduct of its licensed competitors. The sanctioning body owns the rulebook. In 2003, Section 12-4-A of the NASCAR rulebook gave administrators broad authority to penalize any driver for actions detrimental to stock car racing. Furthermore, NASCAR possessed a strict zero-tolerance substance abuse policy. Professional auto racing is an inherently dangerous industrial activity. Driving a 3,400-pound truck at 180 miles per hour requires absolute neurological clarity. A driver impaired by narcotics or alcohol is a lethal threat to the other 35 competitors on the track, the pit crews, and the spectators in the grandstands. NASCAR officials did not wait for the Kentucky court system to process the criminal charges. They initiated their own internal administrative protocol. NASCAR ordered Brian Rose to immediately submit to a mandatory drug test. The protocol required a supervised urine analysis to detect the presence of THC, alcohol, or any other prohibited chemical substances in his system. Rose made a calculated decision. He flatly refused to take the test. Under the statutory framework of NASCAR's rulebook, refusing to submit to a mandated drug test is treated exactly the same as returning a positive test. The refusal eliminates the need for laboratory confirmation. It is an automatic forfeiture of the driver's license to compete. The administrative hammer dropped instantly. NASCAR issued a formal statement announcing that Brian Rose was suspended indefinitely from all NASCAR-sanctioned events. The term indefinite is crucial. It was not a two-race penalty. It was not a fine. It was a complete revocation of his right to enter a NASCAR garage area. To be reinstated, a driver must undergo comprehensive NASCAR-approved medical evaluation, complete a strict rehabilitation program, and submit to continuous, unannounced drug testing for years. In 2003, that specific road to recovery infrastructure was still being developed, making indefinite suspensions incredibly difficult to overcome. The financial and professional fallout was immediate. Rick Ware Racing could not field a suspended driver. The number 51 truck required a new occupant. Any potential sponsors that the Rose family had been negotiating with immediately terminated contact. Corporate entities do not place their logos on the vehicles of drivers facing felony gun and drug charges. Within a span of 48 hours, Brian Rose lost his freedom, his vehicle, his concealed weapon, his racing license, and his entire professional identity. The incident on the US 31W bypass was not just a lapse in judgment. It was a structural collapse of his self-control. The racing industry viewed the arrest not as an anomaly, but as the final public confirmation of the internal behavioral issues that had gotten him fired from Bobby Hamilton Racing the previous year. Brian Rose was out of the sport. His family's money could no longer buy him a seat. He was facing the Kentucky criminal justice system, and while he navigated the legal fallout of the gun and drug charges, a much larger, more sophisticated criminal apparatus was beginning to take shape within his family, one that would soon pivot from street-level traffic stops to multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud. The suspension of Brian Rose from the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series in 2003 isolated him from professional motorsports. He was stripped of his competition license and faced local criminal charges in Kentucky for weapon and narcotics possession. However, the behavioral baseline for the Rose family was not limited to street-level traffic offenses. While Brian Rose navigated his suspension, the structural integrity of his father's business empire was actively collapsing under federal scrutiny. David Rose, the primary financier of Brian's racing career, operated heavily within the energy sector. He utilized corporate entities to solicit capital from private investors. Between 2007 and 2009, this operation was exposed not as a legitimate energy exploration firm, but as a highly structured financial fraud. The mechanics of the father's operation were based on the oil and gas industry. David Rose pitched investors on purchasing working interests in domestic oil and gas wells. In legitimate energy exploration, a working interest grants an investor a percentage of the revenue generated by the extraction and sale of fossil fuels from a specific well. It also requires the investor to share the operational costs of drilling, casing, and maintaining that well. The drilling process requires heavy machinery, rotary rigs, steel piping, and complex geological surveys. It is a capital-intensive industrial process. David Rose bypassed the industrial reality entirely. He orchestrated a scheme where he sold working interests in wells that were either completely barren or physically non-existent. Federal court records detail the mechanics of the deception. To convince investors to transfer capital, David Rose authorized the distribution of fabricated documents. Investors received falsified drilling logs. They were sent fraudulent production reports indicating that the wells were actively pumping oil and generating revenue. The paperwork was designed to mimic legitimate geological and financial data. The investors wired funds directly into corporate accounts controlled by David Rose. The capital was not deployed to lease drilling equipment or hire petroleum engineers. It was systematically diverted for personal use. This type of operation constitutes a direct violation of federal law. Using the U.S. Postal Service or interstate electronic communications to facilitate a scheme to defraud individuals of money is classified as mail fraud and wire fraud. Furthermore, illegal income is still legally taxable under the United States Internal Revenue Code. David Rose did not report the millions of dollars he extracted from the fraudulent oil and gas investors to the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division operates with forensic accountants who track the movement of undeclared capital. They identified a massive discrepancy between David Rose's actual extracted wealth and his filed tax returns. The federal government intervened. David Rose was indicted. The legal proceedings culminated in federal court. The prosecution presented the fabricated production reports, the bank transfer records, and the internal accounting of the non-existent wells. David Rose was convicted of orchestrating the fraud and evading taxes. The sentencing was severe. A federal judge sentenced David Rose to 52 months in federal prison. He was ordered to pay back $15 million in direct restitution to the victims of the oil and gas scheme. Additionally, the court documented that he had successfully evaded over $200,000 in federal income taxes. The primary architect of the Rose family's wealth was incarcerated. The capital that had previously purchased Brian Rose's position in the NASCAR garage was seized or marked for restitution. Simultaneously, in the year 2010, the administrative status of Brian Rose within NASCAR shifted. 7 years had passed since the traffic stop in Bowling Green. NASCAR's internal policies regarding suspended drivers require strict adherence to a reinstatement protocol. A driver cannot simply reapply for a license. They must undergo evaluation by a designated substance abuse professional, complete a mandated rehabilitation curriculum, and submit to a continuous unannounced drug testing regimen administered by an independent medical laboratory. In the spring of 2010, Brian Rose met the administrative requirements set by NASCAR. The sanctioning body lifted his indefinite suspension. He was officially cleared to return to competition, but the racing industry in 2010 was fundamentally different from the industry he left in 2003. The series had been rebranded as the NASCAR Camping World Truck Series. The mechanical specifications of the vehicles had evolved. The chassis designs were stiffer. The aerodynamic packages were different, altering how the air moved over the front splitter and rear spoiler. The suspension technology had advanced, requiring drivers to possess a highly technical understanding of coil binding and bump stop setups. Brian Rose had been completely absent from this development cycle for 7 years. He possessed zero relevant technical data. He lacked the muscular memory and the reflex timing required to control a modern racing truck at 170 miles per hour. Furthermore, with his father in federal prison and the family wealth dismantled by the $15 million restitution order, Rose could no longer buy a seat in Tier 1 factory-backed equipment. He secured an opportunity with Rick Ware Racing, a team that traditionally operated in the lower tiers of the garage, fielding underfunded trucks for drivers attempting to gain track time. Rose attempted his professional return in April 2010 at Nashville Superspeedway. Nashville Superspeedway is a 1.33-mile D-shaped oval. The crucial mechanical factor of this facility is the racing surface. It is constructed entirely of concrete. Concrete does not behave like asphalt. It does not expand, contract, or absorb heat in the same manner. It is highly abrasive on Goodyear racing tires. It requires a highly specific chassis setup, prioritizing mechanical grip over aerodynamic downforce. The competition format required drivers to qualify on speed. If a driver did not post a fast enough lap time during the single-car qualifying session, they were eliminated from the event. Rose entered the number 16 truck. He drove the truck onto the concrete surface. He attempted to execute a qualifying lap. The speed was not there. The truck lacked the mechanical grip, and Rose lacked the precision to maximize the throttle application off the corners. He failed to qualify. The truck was loaded onto the hauler, and he was sent home before the race began. He made a second attempt 1 month later, in May 2010. The event was the O'Reilly Auto Parts 250 at Kansas Speedway. Kansas Speedway is a 1.5-mile asphalt trioval. The track demands high aerodynamic stability. The speeds entering Turn 1 easily exceed 170 miles per hour. Rose was entered in the number 11 truck. This time, he managed to make the starting grid. The race began. Rose was immediately relegated to the rear of the field, struggling to maintain the minimum required speed. His return to active competition ended abruptly. During the race, Rose lost control of the vehicle. The truck was involved in a collision. The sheet metal was crushed. The aerodynamic integrity of the vehicle was destroyed, and the internal suspension components were critically damaged. The truck could not be repaired on pit road. Brian Rose navigated the wrecked vehicle behind the wall and into the garage area. The officials recorded a DNF next to his name. He unbuckled his safety harness, disconnected his radio helmet, and stepped out of the destroyed truck. He never drove a vehicle in a NASCAR-sanctioned event again. The physical reality of the sport had completely outpaced him. His career as a professional athlete was permanently terminated. With his racing career dead and his father sitting in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, Brian Rose required a new mechanism to generate income. He abandoned the racetrack. He returned to Kentucky and Tennessee. He looked at the blueprint his father had created. He analyzed the mechanics of the oil and gas fraud that had resulted in a 52-month federal sentence. Brian Rose decided to replicate it. In 2011, Brian Rose executed a complete professional pivot. He abandoned the physical mechanics of professional motorsports and entered the highly structured environment of organized financial crime. His father, David Rose, had successfully operated a multi-million-dollar oil and gas fraud before being dismantled by federal investigators. Brian Rose possessed intimate knowledge of his father's operational blueprint. He understood the mechanics of soliciting capital, the structural necessity of fabricated documents, and the psychological vulnerabilities of high-net-worth investors. However, Brian Rose recognized a critical flaw in his father's methodology. The oil and gas sector was heavily scrutinized by regulatory agencies following a surge of domestic drilling frauds. Rose required a different industrial vehicle to serve as the front for his operation. He selected the Appalachian coal industry. Specifically, he targeted the market for blue gem coal. The efficacy of this fraud hinged entirely on the specific industrial commodity Rose pretended to mine. Blue gem coal is not standard thermal coal used for generating electricity in power plants. It is a highly specialized, geologically rare, metallurgical coal found almost exclusively in the Appalachian Basin, specifically concentrated in southeastern Kentucky and northeastern Tennessee. Blue gem coal possesses distinct physical and chemical properties. It is exceptionally low in ash and sulfur content. When processed, it creates a specific type of silicon metal. This silicon metal is a critical component in the manufacturing of computer microchips, solar panels, and high-strength aluminum alloys. Because of its specialized industrial applications and geographic scarcity, blue gem coal commands a significant price premium on the global commodities market compared to standard thermal coal. In 2011, the demand for silicon metal was surging due to the expansion of the technology and renewable energy sectors. The market price for blue gem coal was highly volatile but extremely lucrative. It was the perfect bait. It offered a plausible narrative of high-yield returns based on immediate, tangible industrial demand. Brian Rose engineered a corporate entity to exploit this market narrative. He established New Century Coal. New Century Coal was registered as a limited liability company. On paper, it was presented as a robust, fully operational mining consortium holding the lease rights to massive untapped veins of blue gem coal in Tennessee and Kentucky. The company produced glossy prospectuses detailing projected extraction rates, geological core sample data, and guaranteed profit margins based on current market prices. The physical reality was entirely different. New Century Coal owned no heavy machinery. It possessed no active extraction permits from the mine, Safety and Health Administration. It employed no mining engineers, geologists, or heavy equipment operators. The company was nothing more than a series of bank accounts, leased office space, and a highly organized telecommunications boiler room. Because Brian Rose carried a public record, specifically the 2003 arrest for a concealed weapon and narcotics, combined with his highly publicized failures in the NASCAR Truck Series, he could not operate as the public face of the company. A simple background check by a diligent investor would instantly collapse the operation. To circumvent this, Rose adopted a fabricated identity. He operated almost exclusively under the alias John Haskins. As John Haskins, he assumed the title of Director of Operations for New Century Coal. The mechanism for extracting capital from investors was highly structured and aggressively executed. Rose and his associates, which eventually included his father David Rose, following his release from federal prison, established a network of telemarketers. These operations are known in law enforcement as boiler rooms. The boiler room operators function in two distinct tiers, fronters and closers. The fronters were responsible for the initial contact. They utilized purchased databases containing the contact information of accredited investors, individuals with a net worth exceeding $1 million or an annual income exceeding $200,000. These databases specifically targeted older demographics, often retirees looking for aggressive alternative investments to outpace inflation. The fronters executed scripted cold calls. Their objective was not to sell the investment immediately, but to gauge interest, qualify the financial capacity of the target, and establish a baseline narrative. They pitched the scarcity of blue gem coal, the booming microchip industry, and the exclusive opportunity to purchase working interests in a fully permitted operational mine. If a target expressed interest and possessed the requisite capital, the call was transferred to a closer. Brian Rose, operating as John Haskins, frequently acted as the primary closer. This is where he weaponized his past. While he concealed his legal history, he selectively utilized his background in high-pressure environments. He possessed the verbal cadence and confidence of a former professional athlete. He spoke with authority regarding heavy machinery, logistics, and operational timelines, skills partially absorbed from years spent in NASCAR garages. He presented himself as a pragmatic, boots-on-the-ground operator who was actively overseeing the extraction process. The financial proposition was direct. Investors were instructed to purchase fractional working interests in specific mining sites. The minimum investment was typically structured in blocks of $50,000 to $100,000. In exchange, the investor was promised a guaranteed percentage of the monthly revenue generated by the sale of the extracted coal. To override the skepticism of the investors, The New Century Coal Syndicate manufactured an extensive paper trail. Federal investigators later determined the sheer volume of forged documents was staggering. When an investor requested proof of operations, Rose and his associates provided fabricated geological surveys. They forged official drilling permits bearing the logos of state environmental protection agencies. They created fake weigh station tickets, indicating that thousands of tons of coal were actively being loaded onto transport trucks. To validate the operational expenses, the syndicate established a network of ghost companies. They registered fictitious equipment leasing firms. These shell entities generated fraudulent invoices for the rental of Caterpillar D10 bulldozers, rotary drilling rigs, and articulated dump trucks. New Century Coal would pay these invoices, creating a documented internal financial loop that made the company appear to be burning capital on legitimate industrial overhead. In reality, the funds were simply being transferred between bank accounts controlled by Brian Rose. The operation was a textbook Ponzi scheme scaled to an industrial level. A Ponzi scheme relies on a continuous influx of new capital to survive. Because New Century Coal was not actually mining or selling coal, it generated zero legitimate revenue. However, to maintain the illusion of profitability and prevent investors from alerting regulatory authorities, the syndicate had to issue monthly dividend checks. When a new investor wired $100,000 into the New Century Coal corporate account, that capital was immediately fractured. Approximately 20% was instantly paid out as a cash commission to the closers and fronters who secured the wire. A portion was siphoned directly into the personal accounts of Brian and David Rose. The remaining capital was used to issue profit distributions to the earlier investors. An early investor would receive a check for $5,000, accompanied by a fabricated production report detailing the exact tonnage of coal extracted that month to generate that specific dividend. The investor, seeing a tangible return on investment, would often reinvest additional capital or recruit associates into the scheme. This financial architecture is inherently unstable. It requires exponential growth to sustain the dividend payments. If the boiler room fails to secure new victims, the capital pool drains, the dividend checks bounce, and the operation collapses. From early 2011 through the summer of 2013, the New Century Coal operation maintained absolute momentum. The syndicate operated with ruthless efficiency. They targeted individuals across the United States. They exploited the technical complexities of the coal industry to confuse investors and justify delays in production. The financial extraction was massive. According to the subsequent federal indictments, the New Century Coal Syndicate successfully defrauded 168 individual investors. The total volume of capital wired into their fraudulent accounts exceeded $14 million. Some estimates presented during the legal proceedings placed the figure closer to $15 million. Brian Rose had successfully transitioned from a failed, heavily funded racing driver to the undisputed architect of a highly lucrative, multi-state organized crime syndicate. He controlled millions of dollars in stolen capital. The acquisition of the funds was strictly calculated. The expenditure of those funds, however, was highly erratic. The capital required laundering. It required integration into the legitimate economy. Brian Rose did not quietly hoard the stolen millions. He deployed the capital with the same lack of discipline that destroyed his racing career, initiating a reckless spending spree that would ultimately trigger a catastrophic federal response. Liquidating this massive influx of stolen capital created an immediate logistical problem for Brian Rose. Stolen capital must be integrated into the legitimate financial system. It cannot remain in the fraudulent corporate accounts of New Century Coal. If the money sits stagnant, it is highly vulnerable to asset freezing by regulatory agencies or civil litigation from suspicious investors. The capital must be moved, converted into physical assets, or washed through secondary financial institutions. This process is money laundering. It requires the systematic layering of transactions to obscure the original source of the funds. Between 2011 and early 2014, the New Century Coal Syndicate initiated a massive capital dispersal operation. The financial mechanics of this dispersal were heavily documented in subsequent federal indictments. The strategy was not sophisticated. It was rapid, high volume, and deeply flawed. Federal banking regulations in the United States operate under the framework of the Bank Secrecy Act. Financial institutions are legally mandated to file a suspicious activity report with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network for any cash transaction exceeding $10,000 or for any series of transactions that appear specifically structured to evade that $10,000 reporting threshold. Rose and his associates attempted to bypass these automated triggers by utilizing a complex network of shell companies and fractured wire transfers. They routed the stolen investor funds from the primary New Century Coal accounts into secondary limited liability companies registered in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Nevada. These secondary LLCs possessed no actual commercial operations. They existed strictly as financial conduits. Once the capital was layered through these conduits, Brian Rose began converting the digital funds into physical high-value assets. The first phase of the asset conversion targeted the exotic automotive market. Vehicles are highly liquid physical assets. They can be purchased quickly and transported across state lines. Federal investigators tracked hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing from the fraudulent coal accounts into high-end automotive dealerships. Rose acquired a fleet of luxury vehicles and performance cars. He did not finance these purchases. The transactions were executed via direct bank wire transfers or cashier's checks. This provided him with clear titles, allowing him to hold the vehicles as untraceable physical equity. The second phase of the capital dispersal involved the gaming industry in Las Vegas, Nevada. Casinos are highly efficient mechanisms for obscuring the origin of capital. The forensic trail is complex. A target wires a large sum of money from a corporate shell account directly to a casino cage. This is designated as front money for high-limit gambling. The target arrives at the casino, draws chips against that front money, and engages in table games. The objective in this laundering phase is not to win. The objective is to play for a designated period, accept minor statistical losses, and then cash out the remaining chips. The casino issues a check to the target for the remaining balance. When that check is deposited into a clean bank account, the funds appear as legitimate, taxable casino winnings. The link to the original fraudulent wire transfer is effectively severed in the eyes of a cursory bank audit. Financial records obtained via federal subpoena confirmed that Brian Rose funneled massive amounts of the New Century coal investor capital into Las Vegas casinos. He engaged in high-stakes gambling sessions, actively bleeding the stolen funds through the tables to wash the remaining capital. The third phase of the expenditure targeted the equestrian industry. Rose utilized the stolen funds to enter the thoroughbred horse racing market. Purchasing thoroughbred bloodstock is a highly capital-intensive venture. It requires securing the physical animal at auction, paying substantial monthly boarding fees to specialized stables, and covering the high overhead costs of trainers, veterinary care, and track entry fees. The transaction record showed Rose actively purchasing racehorses. Similar to the exotic cars, these horses represented physical assets purchased with completely illicit funds, intended to project an image of legitimate generational wealth. Simultaneously, a portion of the fraudulent capital was routed into a highly unconventional secondary business. Forensic accounting uncovered a trail of investor money diverted to fund a commercial adult entertainment production company. This entity was registered to and operated by Brian Rose's wife. The capital was used to lease production equipment, secure filming locations, and cover the operational overhead of the business. However, the most severe miscalculation in Rose's expenditure strategy was his attempt to resurrect his professional racing career. He used the stolen millions to directly finance his own motorsports organization. He established Brian Rose Motorsports. He did not attempt a return to the NASCAR National Touring Series, where the scrutiny and entry barriers were too high. Instead, he targeted the ARCA Truck Series. The ARCA Truck Series was a regional touring division. The vehicles utilized similar chassis designs to the older NASCAR Craftsman trucks, powered by Crate V8 engines. Operating a team in this series still required massive capital overhead. Brian Rose Motorsports was built entirely on the fraudulent foundation of New Century Coal. Rose purchased custom-fabricated racing chassis. He bought specialized racing engines. He acquired a heavy-duty transport hauler to move the equipment between tracks. He hired a crew of mechanics. He purchased specialized Goodyear racing tires for every event. He paid entry fees. Every single operational cost of the racing team, including the fuel burned on the track, was financed entirely by the life savings of his victims. He was essentially driving a physical manifestation of a federal wire fraud. This level of reckless, high-visibility spending is structurally incompatible with a long-term financial fraud. The sheer velocity of the capital movement triggered internal banking alerts. Multiple financial institutions flagged the rapid influx of wire transfers from individual private investors into the New Century Coal accounts, followed immediately by massive outbound wires to casinos, car dealerships, and horse auctions. The banks filed the mandatory suspicious activity reports. These reports bypassed local and state law enforcement. They were routed directly to the federal level. The United States Secret Service assumed jurisdiction. While the general public associates the Secret Service with presidential protection, their primary statutory mandate is the protection of the United States financial infrastructure. They possess explicit federal authority to investigate systemic wire fraud, money laundering, and large-scale financial crimes. The Secret Service, operating out of the field office in the Eastern District of Tennessee, initiated a comprehensive covert investigation. They did not immediately alert Rose or his associates. They operated in the data collection phase for months. Federal agents utilized grand jury subpoenas to secure the internal banking records of New Century Coal and all associated shell companies. Forensic accountants mapped the exact flow of the $14 million. They identified the boiler room operations. They tracked the outbound wires to Las Vegas. They matched the forged geological reports and fake MSHA permits against official state records. They compiled a flawless, mathematically undeniable dossier of the entire operation. They verified that the Blue Gem coal mines did not exist. They verified that the operational invoices were completely fabricated. They verified that the dividend checks paid to early investors were funded entirely by the deposits of new investors. By the summer of 2014, the evidentiary threshold was met. The United States Attorney's Office authorized the takedown. The execution was precise. Federal raids in white-collar fraud cases are designed to instantly secure physical evidence and prevent the destruction of digital data. They require coordinated, simultaneous strikes across multiple locations. In June 2014, the Secret Service, supported by allied federal and state agencies, executed multiple search and arrest warrants. Agents breached the operational offices of the boiler rooms. They seized the telecommunications equipment, the investor lead lists, and the forged geological documents. They secured the hard drives containing the internal accounting ledgers. Simultaneously, federal agents moved on the physical assets. The U.S. Marshal Service was authorized to execute asset forfeiture protocols. They impounded the fleet of exotic vehicles. They seized the thoroughbred racehorses. They located the Brian Rose Motorsports facility and seized the racing trucks, the engines, the fabrication equipment, and the transport hauler. Furthermore, the Department of Justice secured emergency federal court orders to immediately freeze every bank account associated with Brian Rose, David Rose, John Haskins, and New Century Coal. The remaining liquid capital was locked down, preventing any offshore transfers. The financial infrastructure of the syndicate was completely neutralized in a single day. Brian Rose was taken into federal custody. The facade of the wealthy coal executive and the independent race team owner was instantly shattered. The operational phase of the fraud was permanently terminated. The mechanics of the federal justice system took over. The 168 victims had lost their capital, and the perpetrators were now facing the absolute reality of federal indictments. On June 27, 2014, the federal government officially dismantled the New Century Coal operation. The United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Tennessee unsealed a comprehensive federal indictment. The legal document outlined a massive multi-state criminal conspiracy. The primary target was Brian Christopher Rose. The United States Secret Service had compiled a flawless forensic accounting of the $14 million extracted from the 168 victims. The evidentiary file contained the forged geological surveys, the fabricated bank records, the recorded boiler room phone calls, and the exact routing numbers used to launder the stolen capital. The federal grand jury indicted Brian Rose and 8 co-conspirators. The network of 9 individuals included his father, David Rose. David Rose had recently been released from a federal penitentiary after serving a 52-month sentence for a nearly identical oil and gas fraud. He was immediately pulled back into the federal justice system. The syndicate also included boiler room managers, designated closers, and administrative personnel who facilitated the forged documentation. The specific federal charges were severe. Rose and his associates were charged under Title 18 of the United States Code. The primary counts were conspiracy to commit wire fraud and mail fraud. Wire fraud and mail fraud are the foundational statutes used by the Department of Justice to prosecute complex white-collar crime. A single email containing a fabricated production report or a single interstate phone call soliciting investment for a non-existent coal mine constitutes a distinct federal offense. Each count carries a maximum statutory penalty of 20 years in federal prison. The government possessed evidence of hundreds of these individual transactions. The legal reality for Brian Rose was absolute. In the federal judicial system, the conviction rate for cases brought by the Secret Service and the Department of Justice exceeds 95%. The government does not execute high-profile raids unless the mathematical and forensic evidence is impenetrable. Faced with the seized hard drives, the intercepted bank wires, and the prospect of spending the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary, Brian Rose abandoned his right to a trial by jury. He could not defend the mechanics of the operation. The Blue Gem coal did not exist. On December 1, 2014, Brian Rose signed a plea agreement. He stood before a federal judge and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire and mail fraud. The sentencing phase required the federal court to determine the exact punitive measures for the entire Rose family. The system moved slowly, meticulously cataloging the financial damage before dispensing the penalties. In 2016, U.S. District Judge J. Ronnie Greer handed down the final sentences. The judgments permanently eradicated the Rose family's standing in both the corporate and motorsports industries. Brian Rose, the former driver of the number 51 and number 4 racing trucks, was sentenced to 108 months in federal prison. This equated to exactly 9 years of hard time in the Federal Bureau of Prison system. He was 36 years old. The court did not show leniency to the repeat offenders or the operational accomplices. David Rose, having demonstrated zero rehabilitation from his previous federal incarceration, was sentenced to an additional 18 months in federal prison. The financial infrastructure of the family was completely dismantled. The federal court recognized the involvement of Brian Rose's wife in the secondary laundering operations. She was prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced to serve 3 years in federal prison. The physical assets purchased with the stolen $14 million were systematically liquidated. The United States Marshal Service assumed control of the seized property. The fleet of exotic cars was auctioned. The thoroughbred racehorses were sold off. The chassis, engines, and transport hauler belonging to Brian Rose Motorsports were liquidated to the highest bidder. The capital generated from these federal auctions was routed into a restitution fund. The court ordered Brian Rose and his co-defendants to pay $14,092,205 in joint restitution. However, the liquidation of cars and racing trucks covers only a fraction of the stolen capital. The majority of the $14 million was permanently lost, burned in Las Vegas casinos, squandered on high-risk investments, and consumed by the operational overhead of the boiler rooms. The 168 victims, many of whom were retirees, stripped of their life savings, received pennies on the dollar. The legacy of Brian Rose in the NASCAR garage is brief and strictly administrative. He is not remembered for his vehicle control or his technical feedback. The fallout from heavily funded drivers operating with illicit capital forced a structural shift in how racing organizations process sponsorship money. In the years following the New Century coal collapse, the sanctioning body and individual team owners instituted far stricter financial compliance protocols. Handshake deals and unverified family wealth were subjected to rigorous background checks. Teams now utilize corporate compliance officers to verify the origin of sponsorship funds, specifically to prevent racing operations from being used as money laundering conduits for federal wire frauds. Brian Rose was granted access to elite factory-backed machinery in the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series. He was given a mechanical advantage that thousands of short-track racers work their entire lives to achieve and never reach. He squandered that advantage on a public highway with a loaded .38 caliber handgun and concealed narcotics. He chose to replace his racing career with a highly organized criminal syndicate. He traded a third-place finish at Daytona International Speedway for a 108-month federal prison sentence. Professional auto racing is an industry built on absolute physical and mechanical realities. The vehicles do not lie. The stopwatch does not lie. When Brian Rose applied his lack of discipline to the financial sector, the federal government applied the exact same rigid accountability. The record is permanently closed.